My stepmother decided that my family heirlooms were her personal emergency fund, in case her precious son got into trouble. Yep, she actually tried to sell my grandfather's watch to cover his latest debts. Think she stopped there? What happened next turned her life into a living nightmare. But let's go in order. My name's Jason. I'm 26. And let's admit it right off the bat, my family is a complete mess. It's like they decided to star in some survival reality show on purpose. At some point, my dad decided that marrying Linda was a brilliant idea. And from that moment, everything's been going downhill. Linda is, to put it mildly, the classic nightmare of a stepmother. Entirely self-absorbed, cunning, and clueless about boundaries. She's only interested in her own comfort, and no matter what she says, family comes last for her. Oh, and then there's her son, Zach, age 22. If Linda is the main attraction in this family circus, then Zach is her perpetual loser sidekick. This guy, he's a walking disaster. Constant debts, run-ins with the law, shady friends, the whole package. And the funniest part? He can't hold down a job for more than a month. He doesn't even try. Stability is a foreign concept to him. But Linda adores him and justifies everything he does by saying, he's just a creative soul who needs freedom. Right, of course. And so, with all this as a backdrop, the surreal truly begins. My grandfather, my dad's father, left me an antique heirloom, a watch he bequeathed to me before he passed away. It wasn't just an heirloom, it was a real treasure, the last reminder of a man who had always been there for me. I guarded that watch with my life. But Linda, apparently, decided that family heirlooms are things you can just sell off at a yard sale if money is needed. And why? To bail Zach out of yet another pit he dug himself into. Turns out her precious son had gotten himself buried up to his ears in debt again. His credit cards were maxed out, and some shady creditors were already lining up to have a talk with him. So now Linda seriously thought that my grandfather's watch was her personal emergency stash for Zach's latest crisis. And how did I find out? Purely by accident. I overheard her on the phone discussing some very old watch, probably valuable. Honestly, my eyes nearly popped out of my head. Was she serious? Did she really think she could just take and sell my memory of my grandfather? To her, it was apparently nothing more than a pretty trinket that could quickly be turned into cash. Saying that I was furious doesn't even begin to cover it. My blood was boiling. Enough was enough. I decided she wasn't going to pull off this scheme. No way was I going to let her sell my grandfather's watch to bail out that freeloader yet again. If Linda thought she could get away with this, she'd clearly underestimated me. So, I realized that I couldn't handle this on my own. After all, Linda wasn't just my stepmother. She was a professional manipulator, and I knew that if I just came to my dad with the truth directly, he'd either not believe me or decide to keep the family peace. Perfect, right? But I wasn't about to back down, so a plan quickly took shape. First, I needed to make Dad see that his perfect wife wasn't the person he imagined her to be. You get it? She's the type who pretends to be the caring wife, but is actually just waiting for an opportunity to empty his wallet for her son's benefit. But to get Dad to truly take this seriously, I needed a hook, or rather, something more visual. I invited him out to dinner and started out slowly. We chatted about random stuff, and then I casually mentioned Grandpa's watch. Hey, Dad, remember how Grandpa was so obsessed with that watch? He'd even get up at night to check on it, like it was a newborn. Dad laughed, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. This was my chance. I waited until he was in a nostalgic mood, and then I told him that Linda was planning to sell the watch for Zach's latest stunt. As soon as I said it, his jaw practically hit the floor. You're joking, right? She's planning to sell that watch? The one Grandpa left you? I nodded, and for some added drama said, yeah, she's already found a potential buyer. I overheard her talking to someone on the phone. I had to make it convincing, right? I could see him struggling with himself. Linda knew exactly how to play him, and if I'd left it at that, he'd likely go to her with some "let's talk about trust and honesty" speech. So, plan B was a fake buyer. I found a friend who agreed to play the part of an interested buyer. He really got into the role, especially since he was offering a decent sum for the watch. Dad was shocked too. Wow, that much? I didn't think it was worth that. And finally, I saw him starting to doubt Linda. But I didn't stop there. I knew that if Linda saw a large amount of money, she'd bite. I just had to wait until she agreed to the deal. I arranged everything so that when she signed the papers, she'd effectively be signing over part of her assets to me, and Dad would back me up if needed. Then it was just a matter of waiting for her to make a mistake. Well, Linda, let the game begin. The moment I said it, my dad's jaw practically dropped. You're kidding, right? She's going to sell those watches? The watches? I nodded and, to add some drama, said, Yeah, she's already found a potential buyer. I overheard her discussing it with someone on the phone. How else was I going to convince him? I could see him wrestling with his thoughts. Of course. Linda knew how to manipulate him, and if I had just left things like this, he would have gone to her with some trust and honesty speech. So, Plan B involved a fake buyer. I found a friend who was willing to play the role of an interested buyer. The guy really got into character, especially since he was offering a solid sum for the watches. My dad was shocked too. Wow, that much? I didn't even think they were worth that. Finally, I could see him beginning to doubt Linda. But I didn't stop there. I knew that if Linda saw a large sum, she'd jump at it. All I had to do was wait for her to agree to the deal. I set everything up so that by signing the documents, she would essentially agree to transfer some property rights over to me. And Dad would be on my side if it came down to it. There was only one thing left to do. Catch her at a moment of weakness. Well, Linda, the game has begun. Realizing that I couldn't win this battle alone, I decided it was time to call in the heavy artillery, my dad. He, of course, had no idea that there was an entire soap opera unfolding behind the scenes of his life, but I was ready to use him to his fullest potential. The problem was that my dad is a gentle soul, while Linda is a master manipulator. If I had just told him the truth, he probably would have twisted it to save his precious wife. But I was determined. So I invited him out for lunch. You know, to make everything look as innocent as possible. We were sitting in a cafe chatting about random things as I slowly eased into the main topic, fishing for a reaction. Hey, Dad, remember Grandpa's old watch? The one he left to me? You know, the one with the chain and all those gears? He always said it was a symbol of our family, I said, acting as if it was just a casual question. Dad nodded, lost in nostalgia. There was a touch of sadness in his eyes, which played right into my hands. It was time to set the main plan in motion. Anyway, Linda's planning to sell it, I said calmly. I just watched his reaction, as if this news was no bigger deal to me than saying, "Oh, look, it's raining." He literally froze. He stared at me as if I'd just told him Linda was an FBI agent. Wait, what? Sell the watch? Why would she even need to do that? He asked, trying to make sense of it. Well, you know, to cover Zach's debts. Seems like another one of his signature catastrophes, and Linda, of course, is handling it her own way. You won't believe it, but I overheard her talking on the phone about selling those watches, like they're some kind of flea market junk. Dad, naturally, was in shock. He just sat there, clearly not believing his ears. Linda had been playing the role of the good wife so masterfully that to him, this felt like outright betrayal. But I knew that simply telling the truth wouldn't be enough. He needed something more visual. And that's when I had a brilliant plan. To find a buyer. A guy who'd agree to play the part of some big spender, willing to shell out a hefty sum for the watches. This was exactly what was needed. I knew Linda wouldn't be able to resist if someone offered her real money, and a lot of it. She's a serious shopaholic and a lover of luxury, and the chance to cash in on some old watches seemed like an ideal opportunity to her. In the end, I managed to find a friend who was up for the act. We staged an entire scene where he pretended to be seriously interested in the watches and offered a hefty price for them. Dad listened in disbelief, unable to process that all of this was really happening. But most importantly, I knew Linda would take the bait. All that was left was to wait for her to fall into the trap. This buyer was supposed to propose a deal where by signing the documents to transfer the watches, Linda would effectively relinquish a portion of her property rights. Dad was more or less on my side, but I needed Linda to sign everything herself. Otherwise, this might end with a talk about trust and family unity. So I just sat back and waited for her to make a mistake. As soon as Linda started pushing for the sale, the situation reached a boiling point. She and Zach must have been in yet another financial emergency because she was too anxious to wait. Her patience evaporated, and she decided not to waste any more time. She packed up my grandfather's watch and headed straight to the local antique store. It was as if she thought she'd struck gold and was the sole person entitled to decide how to cash in on it. Naturally, I was ready. The moment she left, I got in touch with my buyer, Tom, who had already gotten a crash course from me titled How to Set Up a Stepmother in 10 Minutes. Tom was all in, and we arranged for him to meet Linda at the shop, posing as an influential collector. Yes, he was exactly the type who claimed to buy up antiques left and right, throwing in lines like, "Oh, this is such a rarity, such cultural heritage," with so much flair that even I almost believed him. Naturally, Linda fell for it immediately. Now, picture the scene. Linda, in her best suit, looking every bit like a businesswoman, with an arrogant expression and a sense of self-importance, struts up to Tom, thinking she's about to walk away with a pile of cash. She could almost feel the money in her hands already, imagining shopping sprees and dinners at expensive restaurants. She was practically glowing with excitement, like a child on Christmas morning. Except instead of gifts, she pictured a suitcase full of cash about to drop into her lap. But this is where it got really interesting. Tom examined the watch calmly, acting genuinely impressed. Then he hit her with the classic line. "You know this is quite a valuable piece, but for formalities, we'll need a few signatures." And he pulled out a contract that my lawyer and I had carefully drafted over a few late nights. Linda, suspecting nothing, signed immediately. Who would turn down easy money, right? In reality, however, she was signing away her rights to as much as possible. A little clause ensured that from this moment on, her rights were tied not only to the watch, but also to part of her property. And all of this unfolded right in front of me. I was standing just around the corner, watching as Linda, completely unaware, signed her future over to me. The grin on her face stretched ear to ear, and honestly, I almost wish someone had recorded it. She'd have something to remember later. Meanwhile, Zach burst onto the scene. He stormed into the store shouting things like, "Where's my money?" and "Mom, we had a deal." Imagine the spectacle. Linda frantically trying to calm him down, Tom watching them like it was a circus, and me enjoying the show from the shadows, struggling not to burst out laughing. Their greed and impatience only made my little act progress faster. While Linda was busy soothing Zach, I already knew the deal was sealed, and her signature was in place. My plan was nearing its climax, and everything was unfolding so smoothly, it almost felt as if the universe itself was helping me take revenge. Finally, the day of the deal arrived. Linda was so excited she could barely contain herself. Of course, her brilliant plan to sell the antique watch was about to bring in a hefty sum, and her beloved Zach would be able to breathe easy again, at least until the next crisis. And me? I was sitting in my car in the parking lot nearby, watching the whole circus. I bet if I had a bucket of popcorn, I would have finished it within 5 minutes. Linda, of course, had no idea what was waiting for her. She walked into the room with the air of a queen, fully prepared for this big deal. She met her buyer, our old friend Tom, who had perfectly settled into his role as a serious antique collector. He started off with an entire lecture on the significant legacy of antique watches and how he had been looking for something just like this for his collection. I nearly burst out laughing. Linda even nodded, pretending to understand. Yeah, sure. She took out the watch and placed it on the table in front of Tom like it was something sacred. Tom looked it over with a serious expression, then handed her some paperwork. "I'll need you to sign right here, just as a formality." Linda smirked and didn't even look at the text. She simply signed her name, as if she had $1 million check right under her nose. At that moment, I realized it was done. The finish line. She had just signed away her fate. With her signature in place, I finally stepped out of the car and walked toward them. Picture it. I was calm, smirking as I approached the table where Linda was already eagerly packing up her supposed payout. She'd just sold everything she owned without knowing the game wasn't over yet. "Hey, Linda, did you know you just signed papers transferring the rights to your house and a good portion of your savings?" I said, unable to hide my satisfaction. Her face in that moment, it was somewhere between shock and horror, and honestly, I savored every second of it. Linda froze, realizing she'd just been trapped by her own greed. Her expression shifted from, "What did you just say?" to, "You must be joking," and finally to, "What? You can't do this to me," she growled, reaching out to grab the papers. But I stood my ground like a rock. I held the documents close and leaned in just enough for her to understand it was over. "You've always thought you could use everyone around you to get what you want, Linda. But this time, you were wrong," I whispered, feeling triumph in every cell of my body. She still tried to wriggle out of it, screaming that it was illegal, that I had set her up. But it was all useless. Her plan had shattered right before her eyes, and now I held all the cards. As soon as the news of the deal spread, I knew Zach's reaction would be spectacular. And I was right. Barely had I started celebrating my triumph when he stormed into my house, ready to put on quite a show. Zach, furious and to put it mildly, panicked, looked like he was about to burn down the whole place just to make his outrage clear. He stood in the doorway, breathing heavily and glaring, and I could already hear it in his voice. "Jason, you seriously think you can pull this crap and not pay for it?" I had to hold back my laughter. Honestly, Zach looked like he'd just discovered that his credit cards had turned into pumpkins, and his favorite couch had gone up in smoke. And it was a pretty close comparison. But I kept a straight face and asked him, almost innocently, "Oh, so you're aware? Perfect. That means my plan's actually working." Zach turned red, and I saw his hands clench into fists, like he was ready to hit me. It was hilarious. This guy who could barely handle himself suddenly thought he could threaten me. "You have no idea what kind of mess you've gotten yourself into," he hissed, swearing I'd pay for this. "Oh, I'm shaking, Zach," I sighed, crossing my arms in mock boredom. "You clearly don't understand this little thing called consequences. It was high time to bring down all these little schemes of yours and Mommy's." His face twisted even more. He started yelling about how I'd ruined everything, how I'd destroyed their lives, and how Linda had trusted me. Of course, she trusted me. She didn't even bother reading the documents. Classic. "You know, Zach," I said, stepping a little closer so he could hear every word. "You and your precious mother thought you could control Dad and me however you liked. Thought everyone around you was an idiot? Well, there's your answer. And you know, I'm really enjoying this result." He mumbled something under his breath, but his words had lost their impact. Zach was defeated, and it showed. Rage, despair. It was all there on his face, and I relished every second. Meanwhile, Dad finally opened his eyes. Seeing how Linda had lied to him without a second thought and kept covering up her son's endless messes, he finally cut ties with her. I can't say it was easy for him, but he finally realized that Linda had been using him for her own gain. Now everything was falling apart for Linda. Her kingdom was crumbling, and she was left alone, stripped of everything she'd so carefully built. After all this, Linda became a true persona non grata in the family. Within days, she was removed from the guest list for every upcoming holiday and event, and her former friends, who used to hang on her every word about high principles, started steering clear of her. It was amusing to watch her lose her support squad overnight. This wasn't a show of the good wife. This was reality. The house she considered her personal palace was now mine. Yes, her little world shattered before her eyes, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Even funnier was her expression when she realized she was no longer the lady of this cozy nest. The house had been her pride, her territory, a place where she ruled over everyone, and now she was left watching as her kingdom passed to someone she'd always dismissed as unworthy. Her financial tricks and secret flings, everything came to light. Few people knew it, but Linda was a true master of financial manipulation. But now everyone knew. People who once sighed at her speeches about principles and integrity saw it was all fake. Her reaction? Yes, she tried to fight. She tried to appeal to relatives, claiming, "How can this be? This isn't true." But no one was listening anymore. Her whole web of lies was right there for everyone to see. When you lose trust, you can't regain it with pretty words. Her world shattered into pieces, and even Zach, the one person who might have defended her, fell silent. I'll be honest, watching her downfall was like watching a live show. Every day, I'd hear updates about her desperate attempts to reclaim her status. She'd call friends, relatives, but each conversation ended with awkward exchanges and excuses. This was the final act in her career as a manipulator, and frankly, it was more than entertaining. Sitting in now my house, and looking back on everything that happened, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Yes, the plan had worked perfectly, like something out of a playbook. Linda and Zach were finished, their story over. Their downfall was a spectacle, almost a tragicomedy. But somewhere deep down, I felt a hint of bitterness. You know, like the feeling after a hollow victory, when you've won, but there's still a slight aftertaste. Like something is missing. Maybe it's because my life changed a lot too. You see, when you go through such a battle, even if you win, you're never quite the same. Now I had this house, a symbol of triumph, and at the same time, a reminder of the grim price of justice. Linda and her perfect son Zach were out, and they'd become a constant reminder to me that every lie, every cheap game with someone's trust, eventually ends. And it always ends the same way, with defeat for those who think their world rests on the naivety of others. And the funniest thing? I expected that this feeling of triumph would pass after a couple of days. Like, you win, you get what you want, you move on. But it didn't go away. I looked around these rooms, at all of Linda's masterpieces of furniture, which she'd picked out to showcase her taste, and realized, this is real satisfaction. This victory wasn't just fleeting. I knew I'd earned it, and despite the intensity of it all, I didn't care in the slightest. Now, I had my family's respect too. Dad finally understood that Linda had been manipulating him all along. He turned out to be not as naive as I'd thought, and he managed to reclaim his position, even if it was through my methods. And you know what? I didn't feel a shred of guilt, not for a second. I knew I'd done the right thing, despite the moral dilemmas that had crossed my mind. After all, if you don't stand up for yourself, who will? The ending? Let this be the final page in a story where justice finally stood on my side.